Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from yarkspirifantasyart.com and welcome to another illustration video tutorial. So for this week's tutorial, I will actually be working on the Mayan twin heroes that go by the name of Xpanake and Hanapu. I do apologize if I mispronounce the names. I'm not familiar with the actual proper pronunciation of their names. But these are two heroes that are in the Mayan mythology, and they're fairly well respected from what I've actually was able to get as an insight when I was doing some brief research on it. So in the traditional story, or the story that I came across online mainly, it was interesting because they were essentially ball players, and the Mayans have their own traditional ball game. Now, unless you've actually watched a movie called El Dorado or some documentaries on the Mayan people, you may not actually be familiar with this ball game. And as far as I know, there isn't really any concisive knowledge that's left over which says exactly how the game was played. Now, there is certain things that people seem to be fairly agreed upon, is that essentially the Mayans had actually created or knew how to create rubber balls, and they would essentially use to essentially project or bounce the ball into a very narrow and small hole that was in the wall. So essentially these two characters were essentially very good ball players, and because this is essentially the main sport for the Mayans as well, it actually is a good piece for me to work on because it actually illustrates a lot of the mythology along with some of the strong history that the Mayan people actually have. So working on this piece really helped me stretch and learn some new techniques and experiment with them. So obviously once I had this information, I had to figure out how I was actually going to go about rendering this. So I was looking at actual photos of players playing the ball game, as well as I was actually looking at El Dorado, which was also based off the traditional game that the Mayans did play as well. So taking into account, I was able to come up with this composition. Now, because this is supposed to take place in the underworld as well, because in the story, the two twins are actually summoned to the underworld, essentially. They're expected to essentially die. The main reason is when they were playing, the people from the underworld were actually disturbed by the noise, and they wanted to essentially get rid of them. So I didn't want to make this as cheery as possible. I did want to have some of that volumetric fog that you would normally see as objects recede, but I wanted to give the entire image more of a gloomy and confined look to it. So for this reason, I started off with a very pale palette, and the main light source for this is essentially the torches that I'm planning to actually add in here. Now, because they are supposed to be bouncing a ball within the hoop, the torches have to actually be put in a specific area so that they don't interfere as well. So I put them in the sides of the wall where technically they shouldn't be able to actually be hit. So as you can see right now, I'm working on the main character. And once again, I am referring to actual images that I've found online when I'm actually working out the character design, because I do want to keep this looking as traditional as possible. Now, some of the images that I did find did incorporate some tribal tattoos on the characters. Now, I did not include those tattoos specifically, but they may be something I actually add in later after I've actually finished this video. So I'm really working out the anatomy for this. And this drawing actually it was a fairly long drawing, this one. It took actually close to 8 hours to do, mainly because I had to actually go through a couple of revisions and a couple of tests to see how I was actually going about rendering these characters. I did want to experiment on a couple of different methods for painting these characters' skin tones, so I essentially did a couple of hours of preliminary work before I actually settled on this drawing. This final drawing took about 5 hours to complete. So this drawing itself didn't take as long, but it took an additional 3 hours when I was actually doing the preliminary work to figure out how I was actually going to render out the skin tones, what type of skin tones I was actually going to use. I was also testing out other artists' methods of painting, which were slightly different than my own, just to work on my overall skills. Now, because this character is the closest to the viewer, he will have the most amount of detail. As you can see, I haven't started working on the secondary character. I've only slightly hinted at the amount of detail that will be present. And I actually added a saturation layer that I can turn on and off specifically so I can check my values, because I do need to make sure that there's enough value range within this area to make sense as well. So I'm working on that background character right now. So this is the second brother, and essentially because he's further away, I'm not going to add too much detail other than the main highlights and the main shadows. So just skip forward a bit. I've finished adding some of the extra detail in the characters, and I wanted to show you guys a bit more of the actual background that I'm actually going to be working on for this. As you can see, I'm keeping the architecture fairly simple. I am using reference as I do this, so I'm taking that to give me a guide of how I was actually going about drawing this. But I also wanted to give it a unique look as well. So once I got the reference material, I did alter it slightly in order to fit what I was trying to actually show. So this entire drawing is also drawn in a 1-point perspective. 1 point for this is more dynamic just because you're able to show really the contact between the character and the ball. I will be adding the ball actually fairly shortly once I finish adding some of the background details. So that initial color layer that I just added on the floor is just to give me a general idea of how I'm actually going to put the tiles on the floor. Keeping in mind that at that time period, those stones had to be set in by hand, and they were not necessarily always carved out. So I did want to give it a slightly more rugged look for this drawing. As I'm doing this, I'm actually using exclusively the hard brush to do this. By using a hard brush, it gives me some more solid lines. Now for these sidewalls, however, in order to include a little bit more texture, because I don't want to have to add a texture from an external source, I'm actually using a textured brush for this. Now I did minimize the amount of texture brushes that I used for this entire piece. Essentially I only used the texture brushes for mainly the floor and the walls, because the floors and the walls have more texture to them, unlike the skin, because the skin tends to have more of a softer surface. I did not use anything but the soft brush for actually the characters itself. But any of the other elements surrounding the characters, I did use some texture brushes in combination with the default round and hard brush as well. So I'm just fine-tuning some of the shadows. So you can see I'm just darkening up some of those shadows and refining some of that detail as I go. Now it is important, because I have the torch lights and I do have the light actually showing on the characters. It is important that I add some of that light onto the cobblestones as well, because you would actually see some of that hitting the floor. I'm also adding it on the top of the walls in areas where they would be most affected by this torchlight as well. Adding just some additional details to those walls along with some patterns. Now the patterns shouldn't be very noticeable once again, because they're not supposed to draw too much of your attention away from the characters. The main focus in this entire piece is the characters. I'm just adding the rubber ball right now. Now, generally when a ball is moving in the air, especially depending on its consistency, it will deform slightly. So as a placeholder, I just added the ball in roughly as a round shape, but I will go in later and I will actually purposely deform the ball to help show its path. And by doing that, it gives it more of an organic feel. That's generally done for animation purposes, but you can also use it for illustration as long as you know when and where to use it. Just refining some of those additional shadows in the arm, because I want to really showcase some of those muscles. Just refining some of that, the darker areas in shadow. These are closer to the light, so they'll have the most sharper shadows as a result. And adding these extra shadows really helps make that character pop as a focal point, which is the purpose of this as well. What you see me do is when it switches is I'm actually turning on and off my layers. I do this throughout the piece specifically to check whether or not my values are too harsh or not, or whether the step before it was maybe a better drawing. So I will actually turn off and on certain layers to see if I could get it a better result. Now I just want to hint at some of the hair. So what I'm actually doing is I'm actually painting in the hair, but then I'm also erasing out the excess that I don't want to show. It's a really quick way to get that faded hair to make it look like it's actually moving in the wind. So as you can see, I'm darkening up some additional areas. I'm just adding a little bit more to it. And it makes it look more realistic when you do that. Working on highlights of the arm. And just finishing up the chest area right now. So this entire drawing is almost completed. I will actually add the hoop that this character is actually aiming towards shortly. That will be done off screen though. Adding some textures. If you want to have your say on what's drawn for next week's video tutorial, or have some additional questions about my drawing process, please leave a comment below. I will take the feedback you guys give me and try to answer your questions while working on next week's painting. If you want to see some of my previous works, please feel free to check out the annotations on the side of this video or visit my channel for the full playlist. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you and take care.